Born in Silk and Shadow. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Died Obedient. The axe was cold. That was the thing Mariana remembered most in the end. Not the crowd, not the charges read in Travis's careful, uninflected voice, not even the sight of Celeste watching from the upper window with their son balanced on her hip and a smile arranged neatly on her pretty mouth. It was the cold. It came up through the stone of the courtyard in slow waves, moved through her knees where they pressed against the ground, climbed her spine and settled in her chest like something that had always been waiting to live there. She had planted lavender along the east wall of this courtyard. She could smell it now, faint and sweet beneath the iron of fear and the autumn bite of the morning air. She had ordered the lavender herself, 2 years into her marriage, when the courtyard had been a bare square of cracked stone that embarrassed the household. She had paid for it with her own accounts. She had knelt in the dirt and pressed the first seedlings in herself, because the groundskeeper had looked at her like a merchant's daughter playing at nobility, and she had wanted to prove to him, to the estate, to herself, that she belonged here. She had belonged here more than Travis Aldwell ever had. It didn't seem to matter now. The charges of adultery, dishonor, and conduct unbecoming of the Marchioness of Aldwell are confirmed by evidence presented before this tribunal. Travis's voice carried the way it always had, clean, military, stripped of anything resembling feeling. He was in full Marquis regalia. She had not seen him in full regalia before. He wore it well. He had always been handsome, in the way of men who were built for display, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, the kind of face that read as trustworthy at distance. She had trusted him. For the entirety of their short acquaintance and throughout the full 2 years of his absence, she had trusted him, remained faithful to him, kept herself for him in the quiet, deliberate way of a woman who believed that loyalty was its own kind of love, and that if she waited long enough and worked hard enough and managed his estate with sufficient devotion, he would come home and finally see her. He had come home. He had seen her. He had declared her an adulteress in front of his household and a tribunal of 4 men she had never met, all of whom had the look of officers who owed Travis something significant. The evidence was a letter, intercepted, he said, from a lover she had apparently been conducting correspondence with for over a year. The letter was detailed and compromising and had been written, Mariana knew with absolute certainty, by someone other than herself, because she had spent the 2 years of Travis's absence in a state of such determined, almost punishing fidelity that she hadn't so much as permitted herself to find another man attractive. She had told them so, clearly, repeatedly. No one had written it down. Sentence of death, to be carried out immediately, in accordance with the Aldwell family statutes governing. She stopped listening. She looked up instead, past Travis's shoulder, past the assembled household staff who stood in rigid, frightened rows and could not meet her eyes. She looked at the upper window where Celeste stood. Celeste was 26, auburn-haired, beautiful in the lush, deliberate way of a woman who had always known exactly what she was working with. She and Travis had been together since before the war, since before the marriage, though Mariana had not known that until the first month after the wedding, when the whispers had reached her through the maids. Celeste had a son who was 14 months old. Travis had been gone for 2 years. The mathematics had not escaped Mariana, nor apparently anyone else, though no one had chosen to remark on it in any official capacity. Celeste met her eyes across the courtyard. She smiled. Not cruelty exactly, just the satisfied, private smile of a woman checking a task off a list. So that is what it looks like when you've won, Mariana thought. She had one more thought before the axe fell. It came quietly, without drama, surfacing from some deep and brutally honest part of her that she had been suppressing for 2 years out of devotion to a man who had married her fortune and felt nothing else. You kept yourself for him, she thought. You kept yourself like a sealed vault, like a letter waiting to be opened, like something precious held in careful hands for someone who never once wondered whether you were all right. You had 2 years. You had your freedom and your father's money and a body that never asked anything of you that you wouldn't give it, and you spent them waiting. What a remarkable waste. The cold moved up through her chest and into her throat. Then, there was nothing at all. She woke screaming, or she would have screamed, but her body hadn't caught up to her mind yet. She surfaced from the dark with a great, convulsive gasp, hands flying to her own throat, fingers pressing against skin that was whole and warm and entirely unbroken. And the sound that came out of her was something between a sob and a snarl, raw and ugly and private in a way that she was grateful no one was present to hear. She was in her bridal chamber. She knew it immediately. The toil wallpaper her mother-in-law had chosen and that Mariana had always privately disliked, the particular quality of light through the eastern window in the early morning, the scent of the white roses that had been arranged on every available surface last night for the wedding. The petals had just begun to soften at the edges. Less than a day had passed. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the bedclothes and breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way her father had taught her when she was 12 years old, and panicking over a ledger error that had seemed, at the time, catastrophic. Count the breath in. Count the breath out. Find the facts. Work from the facts. Facts. She was in her bridal chamber in the Aldwell estate. She was alive. She was 22 years old, and her wedding had been yesterday, and Travis had kissed her forehead at dawn this morning, with his travel pack already on his shoulder, and told her he would return to her properly when the war was over. She was not dead. She was not, in fact, anywhere near dead. She was at the very beginning of things. Her hands stopped shaking. She sat with this for a long time, long enough for the morning light to shift from pale gold to something more definite, long enough for the white roses to stop looking like funeral flowers and start looking simply like roses, long enough for the facts to arrange themselves into a shape she could work with. She had lived this before. She did not know how or why. She was not a woman given to mysticism, had never put much stock in stories of the reborn, had always privately categorized such tales alongside merchants' myths and sailors' superstitions. But the memory was too whole, too detailed, too saturated with sensation for it to be anything as simple as a dream. She remembered the cold of the courtyard stone through her knees. She remembered the smell of her own lavender at the moment of her death. She remembered Celeste's smile. She remembered 2 years of loyalty that had been used against her like a weapon. She sat up. She pushed the covers back. She stood in her bridal nightgown in the early morning light of a marriage that had not yet had time to turn against her, and she made a very clear, very quiet decision. Not again. The first 2 weeks she spent learning. In her previous passage through this time, she had been gentle with the estate staff, careful to endear herself, anxious to be liked, aware that she was a merchant's daughter in a noble house, and that this created a particular kind of social precariousness she had to navigate with patience. She had spent those first weeks after Travis's departure trying to make herself acceptable, trying to earn her place, trying to become the Marchioness in fact rather than just in title. This time, she knew who was loyal and who wasn't. She knew which of the maids reported to Celeste, because Celeste had already, even now, been writing to Travis, had already been planting small, careful seeds of doubt in his letters home. She knew which of the estate managers had been skimming accounts for years under the previous Aldwell stewardship, and had been terrified of Mariana's careful bookkeeping. She knew that the groundskeeper, who had looked at her like a merchant's daughter playing at nobility, would, given half a chance, undermine her authority with the outdoor staff. She restructured the household in the first 2 weeks, with the efficient ruthlessness of a woman who had already seen the ending and had no interest in repeating it. She dismissed 3 maids, 2 footmen, and the groundskeeper, all on grounds that were specific, documented, and inarguable. She replaced them with staff of her own choosing, funded from her personal accounts, with contracts that answered to her rather than to the Aldwell estate ledgers. She hired a personal solicitor, not the family solicitor, who was Travis's man, and had him begin a formal accounting of every Voss asset currently funding the Aldwell estate's operations. The head steward, a quiet man named Percival who had worked the estate for 30 years and had watched her in her first life with something close to helpless sympathy, came to her study at the end of the second week and stood in the doorway looking at her with an expression she remembered from her first life. That particular brand of surprised respect that she had been too busy grieving Travis's absence to fully register the first time around. "My lady," he said, "you're not at all what I expected." "No," she agreed, without looking up from her accounts. "I'm not." She paused. She set down her pen. She looked at him with the directness that had, in her first life, been beaten soft by 2 years of patient waiting and 1 morning of devastating betrayal. "I'm going to need someone in this house who is genuinely loyal to the estate, rather than to any particular person's interests. That is a different thing than loyalty to me, and I want to be clear about the distinction. The estate matters. The Voss capital running through these accounts matters. I intend to protect both. Are you a man who can work with that?" Percival was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My lady, I have been waiting 15 years for someone to say exactly that," and came in and sat down, and they worked until midnight. In her first life, Mariana had not left the estate grounds for the first 6 months of her marriage. She had been waiting to be given permission, waiting for Travis to write and say, "Go to the city if you like, take the carriage, enjoy yourself." He never wrote it. She had eventually gone anyway, but by then the habit of waiting had calcified into something harder to name, some deep, patient stillness that she had mistaken for virtue, and that had actually been, she now understood, a kind of self-imposed imprisonment. In her second life, she left for the capital 3 weeks after her wedding. She had business there, legitimate business, meetings with the trading houses that handled the Eastern Voss routes, a conversation with her father's oldest partner about the grain contracts that were coming up for renegotiation. She stayed in the Voss townhouse, which was hers outright, which had nothing to do with Travis or the Aldwell estate, or the question of what a Marchioness was or wasn't permitted to do. She took her meetings, she renegotiated the contracts in terms considerably more favorable than her father's partner had been expecting, from a 22-year-old widow's daughter. She had dinner twice with a woman named Sable, a trader she had met briefly in her first life at a court function, and always regretted not knowing better. In her second life, she sent a note the first evening and Sable wrote back within the hour. And they talked for 5 hours over wine and a cold supper about trade routes, and the irritating persistence of men who assumed numbers were beyond women, and the particular loneliness of being competent in rooms that didn't expect it. On the fourth evening, Sable arrived for dinner with a look that Mariana recognized as the look of someone about to be carefully generous. "There are places in this city," Sable said over the second glass, "for women in your particular situation. Women with means and absent husbands and," she paused, choosing words, "needs that are not currently being attended to." Mariana looked at her. "I'm not suggesting anything that isn't your choice entirely," Sable said. "Only that choice is available." In case it wasn't clear, Mariana was quiet for a moment. In her first life, she would have deflected this. She would have made a small embarrassed noise and changed the subject and gone home to her estate and her account books and her careful chastity, and told herself it was the right thing. "Tell me about these places," she said. The Silver Moth was on a quiet street in the merchant quarter, not seedy, not ostentatious, exactly the kind of establishment that existed in the space between those two things. The door was a deep, lacquered red. There were window boxes with trailing greenery that managed to look both deliberate and artless. A brass moth no larger than a fist was fixed above the lintel. Mariana went on a Thursday evening, dressed plainly and well, her hair pinned up under a dark hood, her merchant's instincts telling her that this was an establishment that priced itself on discretion and could be trusted approximately as far as she could afford. She could afford a great deal. The woman who ran the house was named Osa, compact, sharp-eyed, somewhere in her 50s, with the manner of someone who had heard everything and was therefore interested in very little. She received Mariana in a small private parlor, served her a glass of something warm and spiced, and listened to what she wanted with the attentiveness of a professional. "Handsome," Mariana said. "Discreet. Someone who will not remember my face the following morning, or who will have the good manners to behave as though he doesn't." Osa looked at her for a moment with the particular assessment of someone recalibrating their initial impression. "Third floor," she said. "Room 7. He'll be expecting someone within the hour." She took Mariana's coin. She did not blink at the amount. Mariana finished her wine and went upstairs. The third floor of the Silver Moth was quieter than the floors below. Thicker carpets, lower lamplight. The sounds of the street reduced to something barely perceptible. Room 7 was at the end of the corridor. She stopped outside the door. She was not afraid, exactly. What she felt was something more like the feeling at the top of a very high stair, a kind of heightened awareness of the step being real, of the act being actual rather than contemplated. She was 22 years old. She was a widow's daughter and a marchioness, and a woman who had kept herself in careful storage for a man who didn't deserve the packaging, let alone the contents. She was standing outside a door in a house she had paid to enter, and behind that door was a man who had been engaged to help her dismantle, at long last, the particular kind of self-denial that she had confused with honor. She straightened her spine the way her father had taught her. Before difficult negotiations, she opened the door. The room was warm. Firelight and candles, the air carrying cedar and something underneath that she registered in her body before her mind caught up to it. A deep, complex scent that was nothing like anything she had encountered before. Mariana's skin hummed, a frantic electric vibration that started where her palm pressed against the doorframe and radiated downward. In her first life, she had been a creature of linen and starch, buttoned to the chin. Now, as she stepped toward the bed, the heat rolling off the man there felt like an invitation to burn. The air in the room was heavy, saturated with the scent of salt, and the musk of a body that seemed built for conflict. Her eyes traced the geography of him. The deep, jagged white line of a scar that cut across the hard slab of his pectoral, disappearing beneath the damp sheet bunched at his hips. His pulse throbbed at the base of his throat, a thick, rhythmic beat she could almost taste. He was lying against the pillows with the loose, unguarded sprawl of someone either sleeping or nearly so, but the eyes that opened when she stepped across the threshold were not sleepy. They were gray, darker than she'd expected in the warm light, and for a moment before whatever was ailing him reasserted its grip, they were sharply, startlingly focused. He took her in, all of her, in a single, unhurried sweep that managed to feel less like assessment and more like recognition. And then the focus softened again at the edges, fever and something else clouding it, and his head tipped back against the pillow. He was, and she thought this with the plain-spoken practicality of her merchant's upbringing, extraordinarily beautiful. Not in the clean, decorative way of Travis, who had been handsome the way a well-crafted piece of furniture was handsome. This man was something else entirely. He was broad and dark and marked by living, old scars mapping his chest and shoulders with the matter-of-fact history of someone who had been in real danger more than once. His jaw was sharp. His hair was loose, black, slightly damp at the temples, with the particular perspiration of a body fighting something hard. He's unwell, she thought. He's the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen, she thought, immediately after. She crossed the room. He tracked her movement without lifting his head, those gray eyes following her with an attention that the rest of him seemed too exhausted to match. I was beginning to think no one was coming, he said. His voice was low, roughened with illness, and something under it that was not illness at all, something that moved along her skin like a physical weight. Mariana looked at him in the firelight, and thought about 2 years of waiting in a house she had built with her own money for a man who was even now writing letters home to another woman. She thought about the courtyard and the lavender, and Celeste's smile. She thought about the way the cold had come up through the stone at the end of things, and the last thought she'd had. What a remarkable waste. She reached up and unpinned her hood, and set it on the chair by the bed. I'm here now, she said. His mouth curved. Just slightly, just at the corner, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. And something in the room shifted, the air thickening, the cedar and darkness scent of him deepening in a way that did something entirely unreasonable to her pulse. So you are, he said. She sat on the edge of the bed and touched his jaw, her merchant's hand, with its callus from years of ledger work, against the sharp angle of his face. He closed his eyes for just a moment at the contact, exhaling a hot, ragged breath that fanned across her wrist. I don't know your name, she said. Fletcher, he said. Which was true. The other half he kept behind his teeth. She considered. Arya, she said. Her mother's middle name. Safe enough. Arya, he repeated, and the sound of it in his voice, low, particular, as though he was placing it somewhere careful, made her decision fully and finally solid. She had been dead. She had been 22, and dead on the stones of a courtyard she had built, and no one had stopped it. She was not dead now. She was alive, and the man in front of her was looking at her like she was something worth consuming. She leaned down. When she kissed him, it wasn't the chaste, dry press of lips she had known with Travis. This was a collision. Fletcher made a sound low in his chest, a jagged growl that was half-starved and half-surrender. His hand, large and calloused, came up to find the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the pins of her hair until they gave way, letting the dark mass spill over his chest like ink. He pulled her down, his mouth devouring hers with a desperate, scorched earth hunger that made her head swim. His skin was blistering, yet she pressed closer, her breasts aching against the firm, unyielding muscle of his chest. The friction of her silk gown against his bare skin was an exquisite torture. She could feel the heat of his thighs through the thin fabric, the sheer, staggering weight of his masculinity pinning her to the present moment. He tasted of wine and fire. Every time his tongue swept against hers, a fresh jolt of lightning sparked in her belly, melting the ice that had lived in her marrow since the axe fell. Her hands wandered, no longer seeking permission, mapping the hard ridges of his ribs and the powerful, tensed curves of his shoulders. Fletcher rolled, his strength surprising for a man caught in a fever's grip, pinning her into the soft expanse of the mattress. He buried his face in the sensitive hollow of her shoulder, his breath hot and ragged against her throat. Arya, he groaned, his voice a vibration that rattled her ribs. He didn't just look at her. He consumed her. His hands moved to the ribbons of her bodice, his knuckles grazing the swell of her breasts with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Mariana arched into him, her breath hitching as she felt the cool air hit her skin, followed immediately by the searing heat of his palms. For the first time, she wasn't a merchant's daughter or a neglected wife. She was a woman of flesh and blood, of hunger and silk, taking back the years she had traded for nothing. As he moved over her, the shadow of the courtyard finally vanished, replaced by the crushing, beautiful reality of a man who saw her not as a fortune, but as a flame. Chapter 2. What the fever broke open. She was gone before dawn. Fletcher knew it the moment consciousness returned to him fully, not because the bed was cold, though it was, but because the scent had changed. The room still held traces of her, that extraordinary rain-on-warm-stone omega scent that had hit him like a physical force the moment she crossed the threshold, but it was fading, dissipating into the cedar and candle smoke of the Silver Moth's careful atmosphere. The absence of it was felt in his body the way the absence of warmth is felt, not as a neutral thing, but as a lack. He lay still and took inventory. The fever was gone. That was the first thing. The first real, measurable thing, after 3 weeks of waking each morning to a skull full of hot iron and a body that felt borrowed and badly fitted. His mind was clear in a way it hadn't been since the summit, sharp-edged and fully present. The particular paralysis that the foreign poison had been working through his alpha instincts, that slow, nauseating, deadening, like trying to think through water, was simply gone, lifted. As though it had never been. His physicians had told him it would take a full moon omega. They had said it in the careful, apologetic tone of men delivering information they expected to be punished for, because full moon omegas were rare to the point of existing primarily in older medical texts, and locating one in a city of 300,000 people while keeping the king's condition quiet was the kind of task that had no clean solution. Apparently the solution had walked through a door in a red lacquered pleasure house and introduced herself as Arya. Fletcher sat up slowly. His body responded cleanly, strength returning to his limbs, with the solidity of something restored rather than merely rested. He pressed a hand to his chest. His heartbeat was steady, deep, the alpha rhythm that had been stuttering for weeks now, running even and strong beneath his ribs. He thought about her hands, the merchant's callus on her right middle finger, the particular way she had looked at him when she sat on the edge of his bed, not with hunger exactly, though that had certainly been present, but with something more deliberate underneath it. Something that had the flavor of a decision, reached after long consideration. Whatever she had come to the Silver Moth to find, she had made up her mind about it fully before she arrived. He wanted, with a specificity that surprised him, to know what she had been deciding between. He reached for his shirt, when Osa knocked and entered with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen everything and was startled by nothing. A beta through and through, practical and unbothered. He asked the only question that mattered. The woman from last night. Osa looked at him with the flat, professional gaze of someone paid handsomely for discretion. My guest's privacy. Osa. She made her calculation. She paid for the room and left before fifth bell. That's what I know. Did she give a name? They always give a name. Her expression said clearly she wasn't sharing it. She'll come back or she won't. A pause, perfectly weighted. Sir. The word landed with precisely the amount of meaning Osa intended. Fletcher held her gaze for a moment, then buttoned his cuffs, lifted his coat and left. He did not stop thinking about the scent of rain on warm stone for the entire ride back to the palace. She came back on a Tuesday. He knew because he had asked, not Osa, but one of his own people stationed quietly in the street outside with instructions that came weighted with royal authority. He was there before she arrived. He had been there for an hour, because he was, among many things, thorough. When she pushed open the door to room 7 and found him not horizontal and fever diminished, but sitting in the chair by the fire in full health, the expression that moved across her face was the most interesting thing he had seen in considerable time. It traveled through surprise, something close to alarm, and landed, after a pause that told him she was fast, on careful blankness. You look better, she said. Entirely, he said. Remarkably so. She was still in the doorway, still in the dark cloak, her hair pinned, but she carried herself differently tonight. The nerves of the first visit smoothed away, replaced by something more settled in her spine, the ease of a woman who had made a decision she didn't regret. He could see, now that 3 weeks of poison fog had fully cleared, exactly what he had only half registered before. She was striking, not arranged to be looked at, not fashioned for a drawing room, but striking in the way of something built for function that turns out to be beautiful incidentally. Strong jaw. Dark eyes that showed more intelligence than feeling, by design rather than nature. He was already certain the feeling was there, simply kept behind glass. A mouth that looked as though it very rarely said things it hadn't already thought through twice. His alpha instincts, restored to full force and operating with an enthusiasm that required active management, registered her the moment she stepped into the room. Full moon Omega. The scent of her was extraordinary, deep and layered and complex in a way that ordinary Omega scent was not, something that moved through him below the level of thought and landed in the most fundamental parts of his awareness. He kept his hands still. He kept his face neutral. He had excellent control. This woman was going to be a sustained test of that. You stayed, she said, still in the doorway. Did you expect me not to? I wasn't sure what to expect. Come in. The draft from the corridor is considerable. Her mouth almost smiled. She came in. She closed the door. She moved to the fireplace and stood with her hands extended toward the warmth, her back half to him, and said, to the fire, without preamble, I owe you an honest conversation, I think. Given last time. You don't owe me anything, he said. You came here for a service. I was in the room. She turned at that, and the look she gave him was sharp and assessing and a little surprised. Not at the words, he thought, but at the tone, as though she had expected something more transactional and was recalibrating. That's very straightforward of you. I find it saves time. A pause. You were ill last time. Genuinely ill. Yes. And now you're not. She studied him across the room with those glass-covered eyes. Because of what happened between us. He was quiet for a moment. Then, because she had offered him honesty and he was, in the ways that mattered, fair. Yes. Because of you specifically. What you are. And what am I? An Omega, he said. Full moon born, if I had to specify. It's not common. The scent is. He paused, choosing the word carefully. Distinctive. She looked at him with the expression of someone receiving information that requires significant existing architecture to be rearranged. My parents never had me tested. My mother said designation didn't matter for a merchant's daughter. Your mother was right that it shouldn't matter, Fletcher said. she was wrong that it doesn't. Mariana absorbed this with the particular systematic quality he was already beginning to recognize, sorting it, filing it, following its implications to their ends. Is it a problem? For whatever this is? For whatever this is, he said, no. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached up and unpinned her cloak, laid it over the chair, and crossed the room to where he sat. She stopped in front of him, close enough that her scent hit him with full force, and he had to make a deliberate effort not to show what that did to his alpha senses, and look down at him with an expression he was learning to translate. I have decided something. Good, she said, and reached down and took his hand and drew him up out of the chair. She was entirely different when she wasn't navigating nerves. The first visit had been good, but this was her at full command of herself. She pushed him back toward the bed with a calm, deliberate confidence. He was a man who did not generally let anyone lead, but with her it felt like curiosity, a genuine desire to see what she would do if he simply removed himself from the equation. She took her time. Her hands moved over him with the assurance of a craftsman, mapping the hard planes of his stomach and the tense, heavy line of his shoulders. When her fingers brushed the jagged scar on his chest, he felt a sharp, electric pull that made his breath hitch. Fletcher reached out, his large hands finding the curve of her waist through the silk of her dress. He pulled her down, and the collision of their bodies was more violent than the first time, an eruption of heat and suppressed need. He rolled her beneath him, his weight pressing her into the mattress, his mouth finding the sensitive junction of her neck and shoulder. He inhaled deeply, the rain-on-stone scent of her making his head swim, driving the last remnants of the poison from his blood. Mariana's hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, her body arching to meet his with a desperate scorched earth hunger. The friction of her thighs against his, the soft gasps she made when his tongue traced the shell of her ear, it was a symphony of sensory overload. He shifted, his hand sliding up the smooth silk of her thigh, finding the heat of her skin. She was slick and ready, a silent invitation that he accepted with a low growl. Every movement was measured, every touch a revelation. He watched her face in the flickering firelight, the way her eyes glazed with pleasure, the way her mouth parted as she reached for him. When he finally sank into her, the world narrowed to the point where they joined, a perfect, aching fusion of alpha and omega that felt less like sex and more like a homecoming. Afterward, she lay with her arm across his chest and looked at the ceiling with that private, inward gaze. He looked at the ceiling too, and let the quiet be quiet. Then she said, I don't know your name. Your real one. Fletcher, he said. Which was true. That's not a servant's name, she said, not accusatory. Observational. No, he agreed. A pause. She did not push. He appreciated that. Arya isn't your real name either, he said. No. They lay with that between them for a moment. Two people in a room full of half-truths that were somehow more honest than most whole ones. Tell me something true then, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father taught me accounts before I could reach the desk properly. He had me stand on a footstool for 2 years until I grew. A pause. He said a woman who understood her own money was a woman no one could make helpless. Fletcher turned his head to look at her. The firelight moved across her face, caught the dark of her hair spread loose across the pillow. He was right. He was, she said, and the tense of it told him everything he needed to know about where her father was now. I'm sorry, he said. He died well, she said, which was not the same as saying it didn't hurt, but was the way of someone who had processed grief into something load-bearing. He left me everything. I know how to use it. I believe that entirely, Fletcher said. She looked at him at that. A quick, sideways look, something almost surprised in it, as though she had expected him to qualify the statement or soften it. He hadn't. Tell me something true, she said. He considered. I've been ill for 3 weeks. Before last Tuesday I had not felt like myself since a diplomatic summit in early autumn. Someone arranged a gift for me that I didn't know I'd received until the symptoms started. She absorbed this. A deliberate poisoning. Yes, and I cured it. You did. She was quiet for a moment. That's a great deal of power to carry without knowing you have it. Yes, he said. It is. She didn't ask him who had poisoned him, and he did not volunteer it. The silence was comfortable. The particular comfort of two people who have understood that there are shapes they are not yet ready to fill in. He learned her in pieces, the way a language is learned. Not from a single lesson, but from accumulation. She came back on Thursday. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that. Osa stopped asking questions, and simply ensured room 7 was available. Mariana had mentioned her preference for Valyrian red once, and Fletcher had noted it without comment. It was there from the 3rd visit onward. The visits always began the same way. She arrived, she came in, and the wanting was immediate. His alpha instincts, still recalibrating after weeks of suppression, had apparently decided to make up for lost time. The full moon omega scent of her in a warm room after dark was something that tested every piece of self-control he had spent 31 years developing. She was testing it constantly, and he was not entirely certain she knew. One Thursday she arrived already windswept and sharp-eyed from a long day of trading negotiations, still carrying the focused energy of someone who had been arguing numbers for 6 hours and hadn't fully come down yet. She dropped her cloak and said, "I've been thinking about you since the 4th bell, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." With the absolute directness of a woman who has decided that this room is one place she does not perform, and crossed the room and kissed him before he had fully stood. That night was frantic and raw. He pinned her against the door, the wood cool against her back, while his body was a furnace against her front. He lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist as his hands gripped the curve of her backside, anchoring her to him. The desperation in her touch mirrored his own. She pulled at his shirt, her nails grazing his skin, leaving faint red marks that felt like badges of honor. When he moved into her, it was with a fierce, rhythmic intensity that left them both breathless and shaking against the lacquered wood. He found that particular visit stayed with him for days afterward. Another evening she arrived quiet, not the careful blankness but something softer underneath it, a tiredness that had emotional weight. She didn't say what it was. She came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and he sat beside her, and she leaned her shoulder against his. He didn't ask, and the not asking seemed to be the right thing, because after a while the tension went out of her spine and she turned her face up to his. Not desire, not the deciding look. Something more unguarded than either. He kissed her slowly, deliberately, with none of the usual urgency, and she made a sound against his mouth that he was fairly certain she hadn't intended to make, small and genuine. "What's your real name?" she said afterward, quiet, her head against his shoulder. "Fletcher," he said. Genuinely. "It's the rest that I've been keeping to myself." "The rest," she repeated. Thoughtful. "You speak like an educated man." "I was educated." "You speak like a man who has given orders for a long time." "I have." She lifted her head and looked at him with those glass-covered eyes. "Should I be concerned about who you are outside this room?" He held her gaze. "No," he said, which was true, insofar as he would never let harm come to her. "Should I be concerned about who you are outside this room?" A pause. Something flickered. "Probably," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to him yet. She told him about the marriage on a Saturday in the 7th week, the night she first stayed past dawn. They had been talking for an hour before she touched him that evening, which was new. She had arrived distracted, sitting across from him by the fire with her wineglass and her thoughts visibly elsewhere. "He's been gone 2 years, she said to the fire. "My husband. He's a beta." "A general." Fletcher said nothing. He kept his face still, and his breathing even, and did not show what the word husband did, landing in the room with the weight of something that had always been there, and was only now being named. "He married my fortune," she said, with the flatness of a woman who has arrived at an honest answer after a long argument with herself. "I was 22 and alone, and I mistook ambition for affection. He has a son by another woman, a beta, his mistress, who was with him before the wedding. The child was born 4 months into our marriage." "Mariana," he said without thinking. She went very still. The silence stretched. "That's not the name I gave you," she said quietly. He had made a mistake. He had been paying close attention for 7 weeks, and the name had surfaced from his intelligence report and out of his mouth before his discipline caught it. Now she was looking at him with those glass-covered eyes fully uncovered, and what was underneath them was not anger, but a rapid, thorough reassessment. "No," he said. "It isn't. You know who I am. I made inquiries. After the first night." He held her gaze. "I was not going to apologize for it. You came to me carrying something heavy, and I wanted to understand the shape of it." She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her wineglass, then back at him. "What else do you know?" "Travis Aldwell, Beta General, due for elevation within the month. Celeste Marin, Beta, 1 son. The Voss trading accounts." He paused. "You've been running his estate since the wedding." "Yes. Alone. Thoroughly." He looked at her across the firelight. This Omega who had come to a pleasure house to reclaim something that had been taken from her by patience and devotion, and a man who didn't deserve either, who had cured a king without knowing it, who argued grain tariffs with confidence, and felt something move through his chest that his alpha instincts named with uncomfortable clarity. "He's coming back," she said. "Within the fortnight, they're saying." A pause. "I can't keep coming here." The fire shifted. The shadows moved. "Mariana," he said. Her real name, this time deliberately. "Stay tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set down her wineglass and reached up and unpinned her hair, and it fell loose to the middle of her back. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, not the deciding look, not the careful blankness, but something open and a little bruised and entirely real. "Yes," he said. "That night was a slow, agonizing surrender. There was no urgency, only a deep, bone-weary need for connection. He moved over her with a reverence that made her heart ache, his hands tracing every inch of her body as if he were memorizing a map. When he entered her, it was with a profound, steady depth that drew a long, shaky breath from her lungs. She clung to him, her face buried in the crook of his neck, her body vibrating with a release that was as much emotional as it was physical. In the quiet aftermath, as the fire died down to embers, the bond between them felt like a living thing, rooted in the shadows of the room and the secrets they shared. She was still there when the morning light came through the curtains. Pale gold, early spring, the first genuinely warm morning after a long cold season. Fletcher was awake before her. He lay still and let himself have the luxury of watching her sleep without being observed doing it. She slept efficiently, without waste, curled on her side, with her breathing even. The full moon omega scent of her was deepest like this, when she was fully unguarded, and it did what it always did to his senses. That settling, that anchorage, the sense of a restlessness he hadn't previously identified in himself going quiet. He had been king for 9 years. He had been an alpha for all 31 of his life. He understood power and responsibility, and the particular loneliness of a position that required him to be unreadable to everyone. He had not understood, until 7 weeks of Tuesdays and Thursdays and now this one Saturday morning, what it felt like to be in a room where the loneliness simply wasn't present. She opened her eyes, registered him, registered the morning light, registered that she had stayed. "I should go," she said. "You should," he agreed. She sat up and reached for her hair. He watched her hands work, those capable merchant's hands, the ledger callous, and felt the thing in his chest that said mine settled deeper and more permanently than he was prepared to manage this early in the morning. Chapter 3. The general comes home. She heard the trumpets from the upper window of the Aldwell estate. 3 long notes. The military announcement. The sound that meant a decorated officer was moving through the city gates with full honors. The sound carried across the rooftops and through the glass, and into the sitting room, where Mariana stood, with her account books open on the desk, and her pen still in her hand. She listened to it with the stillness of a woman who has been expecting a particular kind of weather, and has finally heard the first thunder. Travis was home. She set the pen down. She closed the account book. She went to the window and looked out at the gray morning street below, and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way her father had taught her. Count the breath in. Count the breath out. Find the facts. Work from the facts. The facts were these. Travis Aldwell, a beta general and newly made Marquis, was riding through the city gates with a chest full of military honors, 2 years of calculated ambition, and a mistress installed 3 streets away in a townhouse paid for. She had confirmed this in her 3rd week back in her second life, from diverted estate accounts. He was coming home to a wife he had married for her money, and intended, in the fullness of time, to dispose of. He did not know that his wife had spent the last 7 weeks in a pleasure house in the merchant quarter, finding out, in considerable and illuminating detail, exactly what she had been missing while she kept herself for him. He did not know a great many things. Mariana looked at her reflection in the window glass. She was composed and dark-eyed, a merchant's daughter in a marchioness's house. She made sure that her face was arranged into the correct shape before she went downstairs to greet her husband. He was, she had to concede, magnificent to look at. Travis Aldwell had always worn authority well. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and the kind of man whose physical presence filled a room before his personality had time to do anything one way or another. 2 years of active campaign had stripped any softness from him, leaving something harder and more angular. His jaw was sharper, and his eyes were more deliberate. He rode through the estate gates in full dress uniform, with the bearing of a man who had been looked at admiringly for long enough that he had stopped noticing he was doing it. The staff had assembled in the courtyard. Percival stood at their head with the quiet correctness of a man who had organized this particular welcome with his employer's instructions, rather than his own instincts. It was dignified and appropriate, with nothing excessive. Mariana stood at the top of the front steps. She had dressed carefully that morning, though not elaborately. She had learned in her first life that elaborate dress around Travis read as effort, and effort read as need. Need was a position she had no intention of occupying. She wore deep charcoal wool, well cut, her mother's pearl earrings, and her hair pinned up in the simple style that suited her face. She looked like a woman who had been managing a large estate for 2 years, and was moderately pleased with the results, which was precisely what she was. Travis dismounted and looked up at her. Something moved across his face that was too quick to name entirely, but she caught the shape of it. It was surprise, possibly. She had been 22 and soft-edged when he left, still carrying the nervousness of a merchant's daughter newly installed in a noble house. What he was looking at now was something different. It was the same face and the same dark eyes, but the softness had been replaced by something that sat more solidly in the bones. "Mariana," he said. He was perfectly cordial and perfectly uninflected. "Welcome home, my lord," she said, matching his tone. They were, she thought, going to be very polite to each other for a while. The first week was a performance. Travis moved through the estate with the proprietary ease of a man reasserting ownership of a space he had never particularly valued. Mariana observed this with the detached attention of someone watching a play they have seen before and know the ending of. He inspected the grounds and reviewed the estate ledgers. He found them considerably more organized and considerably more favorable than he had apparently expected. He also received a rotating procession of neighbors, local officials, and military acquaintances who came to pay their respects to the new Marquis. He was charming to all of them. He was charming to Mariana in public, in the careful, surface way of a man who understood that appearances required maintenance. He kissed her hand at dinner. He complimented the improvements to the East Wing. He told the Aldwell family solicitor that his Marchioness had managed the estate admirably in his absence. In private, he was absent. He retired to his study after dinner and did not come to her room, nor did he invite her to his. Mariana lay in the dark of her bridal chamber on the opposite side of the house and thought about a room in the Silver Moth, where she had not once been made to feel like a management problem. She felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the territory between them. On the 5th night, she heard him leave the house at the 11th bell. She did not need to wonder where he went. She ended things with Fletcher on the morning of the 6th day. She had been composing the conversation in her head since the trumpets, and she delivered it in the small private parlor at the Silver Moth that Osa offered without being asked. She spoke with the clean, precise economy of a woman who has decided that a thing needs to be done and has resolved to do it without flinching. "Travis is back," she said. "I can't come here anymore." Fletcher was sitting across from her in the firelight. He was very still in the way she had learned, over 7 weeks, to read as the most serious version of him. It was not the stillness of indifference, but of something being managed with considerable effort beneath a composed surface. "I know he's back," Fletcher said. "Then you understand." "I understand what you're saying," he said. "I don't accept it." She looked at him. "It isn't a negotiation." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. You've made your decision, and I'm telling you it's the wrong one." "Fletcher, he's going to move against you," he said quietly. It was not a threat, but a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who has access to information she didn't know he had. "I don't know the exact shape of it yet, but a man like Aldwell doesn't come home to a wife like you and simply settle into domesticity. He married your accounts. He'll want clean access to them, and you're not what he left, Mariana. You're a complication to him now." She was very still. "You've had him investigated. I've had everyone investigated. It's a professional habit. Everyone." Her eyes were sharp on his. "Including me. Especially you," he said, without apology. From the second morning, the fire crackled. She looked at him across the room. This man she had been calling Fletcher for 7 weeks, whose full name and full identity she had been carefully not examining. His bearing, education, and easy authority had been telling her something she had been choosing not to hear. The shape of the unasked question pressed against the inside of her teeth, but she did not ask it. "Not today." "I have to go," she said. He stood when she stood. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. He was close, and the cedar and alpha scent of him hit her omega senses with the same unreasonable force it always had. She found this deeply inconvenient in a conversation that required her to be sensible. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had never once looked at her as anything other than exactly what she was. "Don't disappear," he said quietly. It was not a command, but something more difficult than a command. She looked up at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she stepped back, picked up her cloak, and walked out of the Silver Moth for what she told herself was the last time. She did not look back. She did not trust what her face would do if she did. She disappeared anyway. It was not dramatic. With no packed trunks in the night and nothing that would give Travis ammunition or give Percival cause for alarm. She simply made herself unavailable, in the way that only a woman with her own money, her own properties, and her own name on her own accounts can make herself unavailable. She spent 3 weeks at the Voss townhouse on the grounds of trading business, which was also true because she had legitimate business there. She spent a week at the northern property, which had been her mother's, and which had never had anything to do with the Aldwell estate. She wrote to Travis with perfect correctness, and received his replies with perfect cordiality. She conducted her marriage entirely through paper, which suited them both considerably more than proximity had. She did not go to the Silver Moth. She went nowhere near the merchant quarter. She kept herself busy with the specific, directed busyness of a woman who knows that stillness is where the feelings live, and is not yet ready to sit with them. Fletcher looked for her. She knew because Osa sent a note that was brief and professional, saying only that a mutual acquaintance has inquired after your welfare, and I have informed him that I have no information to share, as is my policy. Twice in the first week, she saw men she didn't recognize but whose type she understood, standing in the street outside the Voss townhouse, with the specific quality of alertness of people paid to observe. She moved to the northern property for a fortnight. His people didn't have that address, and she knew because the street outside was quiet. She told herself she was not hiding, but was simply being sensible. She told herself this with some frequency in the northern property's small morning room, with her account books open in front of her, and her mind somewhere else entirely. Travis moved in the 4th week of his return, which was faster than he had in her first life. She wondered if she had made him nervous. It began with small things. A maid she had hired replaced without her knowledge, and a new footman installed at the front entrance who answered to the estate rather than to her household. She also overheard a conversation between Travis and the family solicitor about the jurisdictional question of the Voss accounts within the context of the Aldwell marriage, conducted in the low, careful tones of men who believe themselves private. She had better hearing than they knew. She had also, in her second life, moved considerably faster than they had planned for. She was in the family solicitor's office when the man arrived the following morning, with her own solicitor seated beside her, and 3 years of documented Voss asset management on the desk between them. The family solicitor, a thin beta named Greer, who had been serving the Aldwell estate since Travis's father's time, and whose loyalties were entirely transparent, looked at her across the desk with the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting a cupboard and found an entirely different room. "The Voss accounts," she said pleasantly, "are held in my name, under the Voss family charter, and are not subject to Aldwell estate jurisdiction under any provision of the marriage contract. I had my solicitor review the contract in full on the morning after my wedding." She paused. "I was thorough." Greer looked at her documents. He looked at her solicitor. He looked back at her. "My lady." "Additionally," she continued, "I have prepared a full accounting of the Voss capital currently underwriting the Aldwell estate's operations. The East Wing renovation. The staff salaries for the 14 members of the household hired during my tenure. The grain contracts renegotiated at improved terms in the second autumn of my marriage. The outstanding debts to 3 separate creditors that I settled from my personal accounts in the first 6 months." She set the document on the desk. It was, by design, formidably thick. "I would like this placed on record." Greer opened his mouth and then closed it. "I would also," she said, "like a divorce." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the fire. "My lady," Greer said, with the pained expression of a man who had not been paid enough for this morning. "That is, the Marquis has not indicated any intention." "I'm aware of what the Marquis has indicated," she said. "I'm indicating something else. Please ensure he receives my position in writing." Travis came to her that evening for the first time since his return. He came to her sitting room, which he had not previously visited, and stood in the doorway with the particular cold-eyed stillness of a man reassessing a situation he had badly miscalculated. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "The divorce request was genuine. I won't grant it." "I know." She set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk in the posture of a woman prepared to be patient for exactly as long as the conversation requires. "I know you won't, Travis. You need the Voss accounts. You need my trading connections, my estate management, and my name on your credit lines with the Eastern banking houses. Without the Voss fortune propping up the Aldwell estate's new Marquis lifestyle, you'd be a decorated soldier with a crumbling property and a mistress's child you can't legitimize." Travis's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Anger, yes, but under it something she recognized as recalculation. He was a beta, and betas were not bound by the same instinctive hierarchies as alphas and omegas, but they had their own kind of cunning. Travis's had always been of the slow, patient, and political variety. "You've been very busy," he said, "for a woman in mourning." "I'm not in mourning." "No," he said. "You're not." He studied her. "Where have you been these past weeks?" "Trading business," she said. "As I wrote, the northern property. My mother's property." "Yes, alone." She met his gaze. "I find I work better alone." He looked at her for a long, cold, measuring moment. She did not look away. In her first life, this look had made her want to apologize for things she hadn't done. In her second life, she found it simply interesting, like the look of a man trying to find the edge of a thing and discovering it doesn't have one. "We will discuss the estate arrangements," he said finally. "When I return from the palace." She stilled. "The palace? I've been summoned." Something in his expression shifted. It was not pride exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a man whose plan is proceeding. A formal summons from the crown to receive the full elevation proceedings. He adjusted his cuff with the ease of a man who considers the conversation concluded. "Prepare to accompany me." The king receives his new Marquis in full court. He left. Mariana sat in the silence of her sitting room and looked at the fire for a long time. The palace. The king. She thought about gray eyes and cedar and darkness, and a man who had said, "I find it saves time," with the unhurried assurance of someone who had never once in his life needed to make himself sound more important than he was. She thought about Fletcher, the name offered easily, while the rest was kept behind his teeth. She thought about a man who had had Travis Aldwell investigated and said, "I've had everyone investigated, it's a professional habit," without flinching. She thought about what kind of man made a professional habit of having decorated military generals investigated. Her merchant's mind, which had been very carefully not following this particular line of arithmetic for 7 weeks, followed it now to its clean, inevitable conclusion. She sat with the answer for a full minute. Then she said, very quietly, to the empty room, "Oh, the palace receiving hall was everything the Aldwell estate was not. It was vast and deliberate, with every surface chosen to remind the people standing in it of exactly how small they were. There was gold and marble, and the particular quality of light that comes through windows designed to make ordinary daylight look like something bestowed rather than merely present." Mariana stood beside Travis in the assembled court and kept her eyes forward and her face composed. She thought about ledgers. It was a technique she had developed in her first life and refined in her second. When the situation required stillness, she thought about numbers. Numbers were clean and did not ambush you. She was thinking about the Eastern grain contracts when the herald's voice cut through the hall's murmur. His Royal Majesty, Fletcher Gideon Ashcroft, Alpha King of the Aldenmore realm, first of his line. He walked in the way she had always known he would, if she had let herself know it. It was the way of a man who had been walked into rooms ahead of him his entire life and had long since stopped registering it. He was tall, dark, and broad through the shoulder. He wore the crown and the formal state coat with the same ease he had worn nothing at all in a candlelit room in the Silver Moth. His face was exactly the face she knew, arranged in the composed, unreadable expression of a king in a public proceeding. His eyes moved through the assembled court with a systematic attention she recognized. That thorough, cataloging gaze she had first mistaken for fever haze was simply how he looked at everything all the time, with or without an audience. The gaze swept the room. It reached her. It stopped. It was not visible, at least not enough for the court to notice, because he was 31 years old, and had been king for 9 years, and had the best control of any person she had ever encountered. But she noticed. She noticed because she knew the difference between Fletcher scanning a room and Fletcher having found what he was looking for. She had learned that difference in 7 weeks of Tuesday and Thursday evenings, in a warm room where there had been nothing to hide behind. His eyes moved on, and the ceremony continued. Mariana stood beside her husband in the assembled court of the king she had been sleeping with for 7 weeks and thought, with the specific clarity of someone who has made a truly spectacular miscalculation, "I am in considerable trouble." Travis was called forward for the formal elevation proceedings, the reading of the honors, the presentation of the expanded title documentation, and the ceremonial sword touch that the crown performed for senior military elevations. Mariana stood in the assembled court and watched her husband kneel before the man she had been calling Fletcher in a pleasure house on the merchant quarter. She felt the particular, vertiginous sensation of 2 separate worlds colliding at speed. Fletcher performed the ceremony with exact, gracious correctness. He said the prescribed words and touched the sword to Travis's shoulder. He welcomed the new Marquis of Aldwell into the elevated peerage, with the warm, measured expression of a king who was entirely focused on the proceedings in front of him. He did not look at her once during the ceremony itself, which told her, given how thoroughly he paid attention to everything, that he was working very hard not to. The reception afterward was the particular kind of social endurance event that Mariana had learned to navigate in her first life. Circulating, smiling, saying the correct things to the correct people in the correct order, and performing the role of the Marchioness of Aldwell with the practiced fluency of someone who had been doing it for 2 years and had no intention of doing it badly. She was in conversation with the wife of a neighboring lord, a beta woman named Saren, when she became aware of someone approaching from her left. She knew before she turned. The scent reached her first. The cedar and that deep, complex alpha warmth that her omega senses had spent 7 weeks cataloging with entirely too much thoroughness. She had exactly 2 seconds to compose her face into something appropriate before she turned and found the king of the Aldenmore realm standing at a polite social distance. He addressed both her and Saren, his expression perfectly calibrated for a king making courteous rounds of his reception. "Lady Saren," he said, with the easy warmth of someone who knows everyone's name and makes it feel like a gift rather than a display. "Your husband's work on the Northern water rights question has been invaluable. Please convey my appreciation." Saren bloomed. She said the appropriate things, and then excused herself with the delighted flutter of a woman who has been personally addressed by the crown and intends to tell people about it for a month. And then there were 2. Mariana looked at him, and he looked at her. The receiving hall moved around them with all its noise and ceremony, and not one person in it had any idea what was happening in the approximately 4 feet of air between the king and the Marchioness of Aldwell. "My lady," he said. His voice was exactly what it always was. Low, even, with that particular timbre she had felt in her sternum more times than she could count. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "No," she said. "We haven't." A pause. Something moved in the gray of his eyes, translated into this larger, more dangerous register. "You look well, thank you, Your Majesty." The title in her mouth felt extraordinary, like saying a word in a foreign language that you have only ever read on a page and are now hearing spoken aloud. The elevation ceremony was beautifully conducted. "We do our best," he said gravely. Something in the gravity of it was so precisely the Fletcher, she knew that she had to look away for a moment, ostensibly to observe the room, but actually to give her face somewhere else to be for 2 seconds. When she looked back, he was watching her with the expression she had last seen across a small parlor in the Silver Moth. It was that stripped, direct, entirely unperformed look that had nothing to do with kings or courts or the careful architecture of public behavior. "My lady," he said, quietly enough that it didn't carry, "I would like to call on you regarding certain estate matters that came to my attention during the elevation proceedings." "Estate matters." She looked at him. "At your convenience," he said, with exactly the right amount of formal courtesy to be unremarkable to anyone watching. "The Crown takes a particular interest in ensuring our elevated peers and their households are well situated." "That's very considerate of the Crown," she said, with exactly the right amount of formal gratitude. They looked at each other for one more moment, this man she had called Fletcher in the dark, and this woman he had called Arya, both of them standing in the full blazing light of who they actually were. Something passed between them that had no name that would survive being said out loud. Then Travis appeared at her elbow with the proprietary placement of a beta who has noticed his wife in private conversation with the king and is running calculations about it. Fletcher turned to him with the seamless, gracious ease of a man who has never once in his life been caught doing anything. "Aldwell," he said. "A word about the eastern border assessments when you have a moment." Travis straightened. "Of course, Your Majesty." Fletcher moved away. Mariana looked at the middle distance and breathed and thought about numbers. She felt the full weight of what she had walked into settle across her shoulders. It was not a burden, but something more complicated than a burden. It was something that felt, in the treacherous and entirely inconvenient honesty of her own chest, like the opposite of one. The game had truly begun. Chapter 4. Everything that was hidden. The royal summons arrived 3 days after the reception. It came in the morning, delivered by a palace courier in the crown livery, and sealed with Fletcher's personal mark, rather than the official state seal. It was a distinction that Mariana clocked immediately, and that Travis, who received it at the breakfast table and broke it open with the self-importance of a man who expected such things now that he was a Marquis, did not appear to notice. The letter was addressed to them both. It was brief, gracious, and entirely unremarkable on its surface. The king wished to discuss certain matters pertaining to the eastern trade routes with the Marchioness of Aldwell, whose reputation for expertise in such areas had reached the crown attention. The Marquis was of course welcome to attend. Refreshments would be provided. It was set for the 3rd afternoon of the week at the 4th bell. Travis read it twice. He set it down. He picked up his coffee with the studied casualness of a man performing ease he did not feel. "The king takes an interest in your trading business," he said. "Apparently," Mariana said, and buttered her bread without looking up. She felt his eyes on her for a moment. It was that slow, calculating beta assessment that she had learned to recognize as Travis thinking rather than feeling, running the angles, and testing the weight of a situation before committing to a position. She had once found his deliberateness reassuring. Now she understood it for what it was. It was not steadiness, but the careful patience of a man who treated every relationship as a transaction and every person as a variable. "We will attend together," he said finally. "Of course," she said. They did not attend together. Travis received a separate summons the following morning. It was also in the crown livery, and also bearing the personal seal, requesting his presence at a military briefing on the 3rd afternoon of the week at the 3rd bell. That was 1 hour before Mariana's appointment. The summons was signed by the king's senior military secretary, and was entirely routine in appearance and entirely deliberate in timing. Travis left for the palace at 2:30. Mariana left at 3:45. She was shown, not to the formal receiving rooms, but to a private study on the upper west wing of the palace. It was a room lined with books and maps and the particular comfortable disorder of a space that was actually used rather than merely occupied. A fire burned in the grate. There was wine on the table, the Valyrian red, which she noted without expression. Fletcher was standing at the window when she was shown in. He turned when the door closed, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the room with all the distance of who they actually were and all the proximity of who they had been. "Mariana," he said. It was just her name. There was no title. Your Majesty, she said. Something moved across his face. Do not, he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room, not all the way to him but to the chair nearest the fire, and sat with the composed deliberateness of a woman choosing her ground. You arranged this very neatly. I arranged it, he agreed. He came away from the window and took the chair across from her, close enough that she could smell the cedar and alpha warmth of him, which was doing the usual unreasonable things to her omega senses. Neatly is a matter of opinion. Travis will notice the timing. Travis is currently in a briefing about eastern border fortifications that will take precisely 1 hour and 15 minutes and will tell him nothing he did not already know, which will give him a great deal of time to think about what his wife is doing in the meantime. He paused. Good. She looked at him sharply. You want him to think. I want him to think whatever he likes, Fletcher said with a calm that she recognized as genuine rather than performed. He married you to control your accounts. He left you alone for 2 years. He has installed his mistress 3 streets from your estate and is currently exploring legal mechanisms to limit your autonomy within the marriage. His jaw set, barely perceptibly. I find I have very limited patience for what Travis Aldwell wants to think. The fire crackled between them. Mariana looked at him. She really looked at him in the full light of a palace study rather than the candlelit warmth of the Silver Moth, and she let herself see what she had been carefully not seeing for 7 weeks. He was exactly who he had always been. That was the thing. There was no difference between the man who had said I find it saves time in a pleasure house bed and the man sitting across from her in the Crown private study. He had the same eyes, the same directness, and the same unhurried attention that made her feel simultaneously like the only person in any room and like someone being very thoroughly understood. The Crown had not made him. It had simply given a name to what was already there. You lied to me, she said. It was not an accusation, but a fact placed on the table between them. I withheld, he said. I withheld consistently, and by omission. I did not lie. The distinction feels slim. The distinction is everything, he said. I never told you I was a kept man. I never confirmed anything you assumed. And you, he paused, the gray eyes steady on hers, were not particularly forthcoming yourself, Arya. The false name between them had a different weight now. She felt it. We were both hiding, she said. Yes. That does not make it simple. No, he agreed. It does not. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the stripped, unperformed directness that had been undoing her sense of equilibrium since the first Tuesday she walked back into room 7. But I am not interested in simple. I am interested in you. I have been interested in nothing else since the morning you left the Silver Moth the first time and took the entire quality of the air in the room with you. Mariana's chest did something she chose not to examine. Fletcher, tell me you felt nothing, he said quietly. Tell me you felt nothing in the receiving hall when you heard the title. She was quiet for a moment that lasted considerably longer than she intended. I felt, she said carefully, a great many things. Then we are in agreement about the substance, he said. The logistics we can manage. The logistics, she repeated with the edge of something that was not quite a laugh. I am a married woman. My husband is in your palace right now. Your husband, Fletcher said, is a problem I am already working on. He is a problem in ways that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with information that has recently come to my attention. He paused. But that is a separate conversation. Right now, I would like to talk about this one. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire moved between them. Then she said, You had better pour the wine, and something in his face shifted. It was something that was not a smile, but lived right next to one, and he reached for the bottle. They talked for an hour before anything else. It was different from the Silver Moth. It was fuller and more direct, 2 people speaking without the comfortable buffer of false names and assumed roles. She asked him about the poisoning with the specificity she had been withholding for 7 weeks, and he told her more than he had told his own counsel. He told her about the Eastern Coalition Summit, the diplomatic envoy, and the slow onset that had been mistaken for an illness until his physicians had finally identified the compound. She listened with her full, unhurried attention and asked questions that showed she had understood everything and was extrapolating accurately. Someone inside your court gave them access, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Someone who knew your schedule and your private movements. Yes. Do you know who? He looked at her for a moment. I have a strong suspicion, he said. I am waiting for confirmation. She absorbed this. That is why you were in the Silver Moth. You could not be treated at the palace. The fewer people who knew the extent of it, the better. There was my personal physician, 2 members of my private guard, and Osa. He paused. And then you. And then me, she said. Accidentally. Accidentally, he agreed. The room was meant to be empty. My physician had the idea that proximity to an omega, any omega, might slow the progression. We had arranged use of the room as a private space. His mouth curved slightly. The arrangement was somewhat overtaken by events. Mariana thought about walking into that room with her heart in her throat, and her 2 years of misplaced fidelity pressing behind her ribs, and a decision made in the part of herself where decisions last. She thought about the man in the bed and the cedar and darkness scent, and the way he had said, "I was beginning to think no one was coming," in a voice that had moved through her like the first real warm day after a long winter. "I had no idea," she said. "I had no idea what I was, or what it would do." "I know," he said. "I did know by the time you had been in the room 30 seconds. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that he was not fully containing. "Full moon omega scent is not like other omega scent, Mariana. It is not just attractive. It is," he stopped and chose the word carefully, "foundational. The alpha instinct does not experience it as want. It experiences it as necessity. It is like air." The room was very quiet. "That sounds," she said carefully, "alarming." "It was," he said. "It still is. I find I am managing." She looked at him. He looked back, and the conversation, which had been balanced on the careful edge of honesty, tipped forward into something else. It was the same something else it always tipped into, and had always tipped into from the very first evening. Because whatever else was complicated about them, this particular thing had never been complicated at all. He kissed her first this time, which was new. In the Silver Moth, he had always let her lead. He had read, correctly, that she needed the agency of it. She needed to choose at every step rather than be chosen, and he had given her that with the attentiveness of someone who paid close attention to what people actually needed, rather than what was easiest to give. But here, in his own space, in a room full of his books and his maps and the accumulated evidence of who he actually was, he closed the distance between them and kissed her with the unhurried, deliberate thoroughness of a man who has been patient for long enough and has decided that patience on this particular point has run its course. She let him. She did more than let him. She kissed him back with 7 weeks of accumulated absence and the specific, bone-deep relief of something that had been held at arm's length finally being allowed to be what it was. She felt him make a sound against her mouth that he had not entirely intended to make. It was low and real, and something about that involuntary honesty undid her more completely than anything practiced could have. "We are in a palace," she said against his jaw sometime later. "My palace," he said into her hair. Relevantly, "Travis is in this building. He is in the East Wing. He is currently being walked through grain storage logistics by my most thorough military secretary." He paused. "We have time." She pulled back enough to look at him. She was flushed and composed, and his gray eyes were darker than usual and entirely focused on her face. "You planned this." "I plan everything," he said. "You knew that about me." She had. She had known it from the second visit, from the way the wine had been the right kind, and the fire had been lit, and he had been there, waiting, with the patience of someone who had decided on a course and arranged the conditions accordingly. She had found it. She could admit this now in a palace study with his hands warm at her waist, deeply and unreasonably appealing. "This is not sensible," she said. "No," he agreed. "My husband. He is a problem with a solution," he said. "Trust me to work on it." She looked at him for a moment. Trusting people had not historically served her well. She had trusted Travis with her loyalty and her patience and 2 years of herself, and he had handed her a death sentence and called it honor. But Fletcher was not Travis, and had never been anything like Travis. The part of her that had spent 7 weeks learning the difference between a man who looked at her and a man who actually saw her knew with calm certainty which kind of man was currently holding her hands in a palace study. "Work quickly," she said. His mouth curved. "I always do." The affair resumed. It was different now. There was no Silver Moth, no false names, and no careful pretense of hired companionship. Fletcher arranged the use of a small private house near the old library quarter, one of several properties the Crown kept for purposes that the official records described with creative vagueness. It was warm and well-stocked and had the particular quality of a space that had been prepared with attention. It had the right wine, the right fire, and a writing desk stocked with the good paper she had mentioned once in passing that she preferred for her accounts. She noticed the paper. She did not mention that she noticed. He did not mention that he had arranged it. They were, she reflected, extraordinarily well matched in the particular social fluency of people who communicate most precisely in the things they do not say. They met when they could. They met twice in the first week and once in the second, when her trading business kept her occupied, and Travis had been watching her movements with an attention she found both irritating and informative. The watching told her things. Travis's beta mind was working and running its calculations, and the calculation it kept returning to involved the king's personal interest in his wife's expertise and what exactly that interest encompassed. Let him wonder, she thought. Wondering kept him occupied, and occupied kept him from moving. But the meetings with Fletcher were not only what happened in the warm dark of the library house, though that was extraordinary. She could admit to herself in the honest privacy of her own mind that it was rawer now than it had been in the Silver Moth. Stripped of the last remaining fiction of transactional arrangement, it had become something she did not have clean language for. He knew her name now. He said it the way no one had ever said it. It was not the way Travis said it, which was the way you say the name of something you own, and it was not the way the household said it, which was obligation dressed as respect. It was the way of someone who has decided that a particular word matters, and intends to treat it accordingly. She was, she acknowledged, in serious difficulty. It was during the third week that she found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had been in Travis's study for an entirely legitimate reason. The household accounts required his signature on 2 outstanding contracts, and Percival had asked her to retrieve them from the desk where Travis had left them 3 days ago and not returned to. She found the contracts. She also found beneath them, folded small and sealed with a cipher she did not recognize, a letter that had been imperfectly hidden by a man who had not expected his desk to be visited. She should not have opened it. She opened it anyway. The hand was not Travis's. It was a careful, educated script she did not recognize, and the language was oblique in the specific way of people who are writing something they cannot afford to have read plainly. But she was a merchant's daughter who had learned codes and ciphers at her father's knee because trading correspondence was full of competitive intelligence. The ability to read between lines was worth more than any single contract, and she read this one 3 times in the cold light of Travis's study and felt the bottom of something drop away. It was not complete. It was one letter from what was clearly a longer correspondence, with references to previous arrangements, to a timeline she did not have the beginning of, and to a resolution that was discussed in terms that were frustratingly unspecific. But there were names. They were partial ones, truncated to initials, but they were enough. There was a D, there was a reference to the Eastern Friends, there was a mention of the Alpha problem that made her stomach go cold in a very specific way. She refolded the letter. She put it back exactly as she had found it, beneath the contracts. She took the contracts. She left the study. She sent a note to Fletcher before the hour was out. He read it twice. They were in the library house. The fire was high, and the wine was untouched for once. She had arrived with the letter's contents in her head and the particular focused energy of someone who has found a piece of information and is still calculating its full weight. He had taken one look at her when she came through the door and set aside whatever he had been planning for the evening and simply said, "Tell me." She told him. She told him every word she could remember, every oblique phrase, every initial, and the cipher on the seal which she had looked at long enough to sketch from memory, and which she now set on the table between them. Fletcher looked at the sketch for a long time. His face did something she had seen only once before. It was that stripped quality where the kingship was temporarily absent. It was just the man underneath it, and the man was very still and very cold, in a way that was more frightening than anger would have been. "The cipher," he said. "You recognize it?" "Yes," he said. He took a pause that had weight in it. "It belongs to a courier who runs between the capital and the eastern border cities. He has been on our watch list for 4 months. "Whose courier?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. The fire moved and the shadows shifted. "My uncle's," he said. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just had its full weight confirmed. "Dorian," she said. She had heard the name. Everyone had heard the name of Lord Dorian Ashcroft, the king's uncle, and a fixture of the court. He was the charming, silver-tongued alpha, who had been at the center of court life for so long, he had become atmospheric. "Dorian," Fletcher confirmed. "And Travis is not the architect. Travis is too beta for that, too practical, and too interested in immediate gain to commit to something with a horizon this long." His jaw set. "He is the instrument. Someone has been using him and promising him something." "Celeste's son," Mariana said with the flat certainty of someone fitting a last piece. "It was legitimization. If the power structure changes, if you are..." She stopped. "If I am removed," he said evenly. "Yes, Dorian has made promises to the Eastern Coalition. He promised support for a new arrangement in exchange for political backing. Travis has been feeding them military intelligence, including troop placements, supply routes, and garrison schedules. In return, Dorian promises him a legitimate heir and a secure title under whatever comes next." The room was very quiet. Mariana thought about the letter. She thought about the Alpha problem, the resolution, and the Eastern Friends. She thought about the garrison towns that had fallen in the second year of Travis's campaign. They were towns that should have held, and that had been reinforced on schedules only senior officers had known. She thought about her trading ships, her father's ships, and the eastern routes. My ships, she said. Fletcher looked at her. The eastern manifests, she said, her voice going flat and precise with the specific tone of someone finding a number that should not be there. I went back through them last month. There were gaps. Cargo that should have been logged was not. I thought it was administrative error. I almost raised it with the trading house. She looked up at him. Someone has been using the Voss trading routes as cover. They have been moving things, information and possibly people, across the eastern border inside legitimate merchant cargo. The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. How long? Fletcher said very quietly. The first gap is 14 months ago, she said. That was before Travis came home. Someone was already using the routes while he was still on campaign. Dorian, Fletcher said, and the word had a finality to it that made the fire seem smaller. He had access to the trading house connections through the court. He would not have needed Travis for that part. He stood, moved to the window, and stood with his back to her for a moment. He needed Travis for the military intelligence, and Travis needed a reason to keep your accounts accessible without your active management interfering. She followed the logic. That is why he was so fast to move against me when he came back. It was not just Celeste. He needed control of the Voss accounts. He needed more than just the money. He needed the trading apparatus and the routes. Yes. And she stopped. She caught herself and started again. If his plan had worked, if he had managed to discredit me, he would have had full access. He would have been managed by Celeste, effectively. She would have been a figurehead. Travis would have had the accounts, and Dorian would have had the routes, and no one would have been looking. Fletcher turned from the window. He looked at her across the room. This was the Omega who had walked into his life by accident, and had just handed him the piece he had been missing for 4 months, assembled from a half-hidden letter and 2 years of meticulous account management. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I need what you have. I need everything. I need the manifests, the gap analysis, and whatever you have documented. I will have it to you by tomorrow morning, she said. Mariana. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. She looked up at him, and his hands came up and framed her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the cold fury she could feel radiating off him, which was specifically not directed at her. He used your ships. He used your father's ships and what he built. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. He did. I am going to dismantle every piece of it. I know, she said. I intend to help. His thumbs moved against her cheekbones in one slow stroke. It was the gesture of a man who is allowing himself something he is ordinarily too controlled to permit. Then he kissed her, and it was different from all the other times. It was heavier and slower and saturated with something she recognized as grief on his part and fury on hers. Underneath both of those things was something that neither of them had named yet, but that had been building since the first Tuesday she had come back to room 7 and found him there, waiting. She kissed him back with everything she was not saying. They stayed late into the night. It was not only in the way of warmth and firelight and each other's hands, but in talking. It was the long, serious, fully honest conversation of two people who have stopped pretending and are building something real from what is left. He told her about Dorian's history, the patterns he had noticed, and the grief of suspecting someone he had trusted. She told him about her first life. She did not call it that, and did not use those words, but she told him about the 2 years, and the waiting and the courtyard, in the way of someone who has processed a wound into information, and is sharing the information. He listened without interrupting. At the end he said only, "He will never touch you again. I will guarantee that personally." "I know," she said. "I am not afraid of him." "I know you are not," Fletcher said. "I am afraid of him on your behalf." "There is a difference." She looked at him. Something moved in her chest that was finished with being careful. "Fletcher," she said. "Yes. Stop being a king for 5 minutes." His mouth curved. It was the real smile, the one she had heard twice before she knew who he was, and had been cataloging ever since. "And be what instead?" "Just the man in the room," she said. "Be the one who was in the bed when I opened the wrong door." He looked at her for a long moment with something so unguarded in it that she felt it in her sternum. "I have been him the whole time," he said quietly. "You just kept calling him your majesty." She reached up and took his face in her hands. They were her merchant's hands, with the ledger callus on the right one. She kissed him once, softly, with all the uncomplicated honesty of a woman who has stopped performing caution. "Fletcher," she said against his mouth. "There," he said. "That is better." The trap was set within the fortnight. Fletcher moved with the patience and precision she had come to understand was his most dangerous quality. It was not the crown or the alpha authority. but the specific, methodical intelligence of a man who did not act until the picture was complete and then acted with total commitment. His intelligence unit worked from her manifests. Dorian's courier was turned. 3 of Travis's contacts within the military were quietly identified and placed under surveillance. The invitation to dinner went to Dorian first. It was private and warm, the kind of summons that looked like an uncle being brought into confidence. Travis's invitation arrived the following day, framed as a witness requirement for a legal matter, which was technically true. Mariana was not on the guest list. She arrived anyway 2 hours before the dinner, and was shown by Fletcher's private guard to the room behind the study. It was a narrow antechamber with a panel that, when slid back 2 inches, provided a clear sightline into the room beyond. Fletcher had shown it to her himself. She had not asked whether showing it to her was protocol or something else. She had simply memorized the dimensions and arrived prepared. She owed it to the girl who had knelt on the courtyard stones to hear it herself. Dorian broke in 40 minutes. He was an alpha, charming and silver-tongued, and entirely accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any room. She supposed that had been true until Fletcher had grown into himself and rendered the assumption obsolete. When the intelligence report was placed in front of him, documented and complete, the charm lasted approximately 90 seconds before the calculation behind it became visible. The calculation landed on an answer it did not like. He tried denial. Fletcher let him finish. He tried reframing. Fletcher let him finish that too. Then Fletcher laid the final piece on the table. It was the manifests, Mariana's analysis, and the gap documentation in her precise, ledger-trained hand. He said very quietly, "The Voss trading routes. You used the Crown ally assets to move intelligence to enemies of this realm. That is not a reframable act, Dorian." Travis arrived to find his county conspirator already dismantled. He looked across the room and found Mariana stepping out of the antechamber door. His face did something she had never seen it do. All the beta calculation, all the patient cunning, and all the careful layering of ambition and performance collapsed at once into something that was almost honest. "You," he said. "You used my father's ships," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "You used his routes and the trade he built from nothing over 40 years. You used it to move intelligence to men who wanted the king dead, and you did it while I was managing your accounts and running your estate and keeping myself for you." She held his gaze. "I want that said plainly. In this room, before whatever comes next. I want it on record that I know exactly what you did." Travis said nothing. "The manifests," she continued, "are thorough. I was always thorough. You should have accounted for that." He went for the door. He did not reach it. The trial was closed, which was Fletcher's concession to the complexity of having his own uncle in the dock. The evidence was not complex. The verdict was not long in arriving. Dorian was stripped, exiled, and escorted to the border within the week. Fletcher signed the order in his private study at midnight, alone, and Mariana learned about it the following morning when he arrived at the library house before she expected him. He sat in the chair by the fire with the specific exhaustion of someone who has done a necessary and terrible thing and is now on the other side of it. She did not ask him how he was. She poured the wine and sat beside him and let the fire be loud while the room was quiet. After a while, he reached over and took her hand and held it without saying anything, and she let him. Travis was not extended the same concession. The tribunal was 3 days. The evidence was thorough. The garrison towns were named, including the men lost in engagements that should not have been lost. They had only been lost because the enemy had known where to be. The trading manifests were entered into record. The correspondence with the Eastern Coalition was read in full. The sentence was carried out on a cold morning in early spring. Mariana was not there. She was in the Voss townhouse, in her mother's chair by the morning room window, with her account books open and a cup of tea cooling beside her. She was not performing the work. She was simply sitting with it, the familiar weight of numbers and columns, and the clean reliability of things that balance when they are meant to balance. She sat with it until the cold morning light shifted into something warmer. Then she closed the book and allowed herself, for the length of one quiet breath, to grieve the girl she had been in another life. She grieved the one who had knelt on her own courtyard stones in the smell of her own lavender, and not understood what she had done wrong. "Nothing," she told that girl. "You did nothing wrong. You were just finished before you got to find out who you were going to be." She let herself feel it fully, and then she let it go. When the second cup of tea had also gone cold, she got up and put on her coat and went to find Fletcher. He was in the palace library when she arrived. It was a room she had not been in before, vast and warm and smelling of old paper and the particular comfort of a place that has been used and loved for generations. He was at the large table near the central window, with papers spread before him, and sleeves rolled to the elbow in the way he always worked when he was not performing being a king. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face. He set down his pen. "How are you?" he said. "Intact," she said. "You?" The same. He took a pause. Come here. She crossed the room and he pushed the chair back. She sat on the edge of the table beside his papers, which was undignified, and she did not care at all. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against her hip, and she put her hand in his hair. They stayed like that for a while in the old warm light of the palace library, two people who had been keeping secrets in the same rooms for 7 weeks, and were now, at last, in the same room without any. My counsel, he said into the wool of her skirt, is going to have opinions. Your counsel, she said, has opinions about everything. You are a widow now, technically. A wealthy widow. He lifted his head and looked up at her, and the gray eyes were entirely unguarded. The king was entirely absent. It was just Fletcher, the man who had been in the bed when she opened the wrong door, and had never for a single moment in all the weeks since looked at her as anything other than exactly what she was. My council will require a queen within the year. They have been exceptionally clear, have they? The list of candidates I am willing to consider, he said, has become extremely short. He reached into his coat and set something on the table beside her. It was a ring of plain gold, with an omega moon carved on the inner band. It was simple and deliberate, and entirely him. In fact, it has exactly one name on it. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. I am not of noble birth, she said. My father sold grain and silk. Your father built something from nothing, he said. He built 3 generations of Voss enterprise in 40 years. He built the trading routes that half this kingdom Eastern economy runs on. He built the ships. He paused. He built the daughter who held his whole estate together for 2 years, while her husband committed treason against the crown, and who noticed and brought me the proof in her own hand. He looked at her steadily. That is not nothing, Mariana. That is exactly the blood I want in the next generation of this crown. She picked up the ring. She turned it in the pale library light. The omega moon on the inner band caught the winter sun and held it. I will think about it, she said. He laughed. It was a real, unguarded laugh, the one she had heard twice before she knew who he was, and had been cataloging ever since. He reached up and took the ring gently from her fingers and held it, waiting. You always say that, he said. And I always decide, she said. Give me a week. She gave him 4 days. On the 5th morning he arrived at the library house and found her at the writing desk with the account books open and the ring on her left hand. The omega moon was facing inward against her skin. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment, with something in his face she had no more interest in pretending not to recognize. She looked up. She met his eyes. Hello, King, she said. He crossed the room and took her hands. He pressed his mouth to the ring, and then to her palm, and then to her wrist. He looked up at her from there with those gray eyes at full force and said very quietly, Hello, Omega. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary morning, entirely unaware that in a small house near the library quarter, a merchant daughter who had died obedient in another life was sitting in the full, uncomplicated light of a future that was, at last, entirely her own. She had earned it. She had earned every single piece of it.